Hi and welcome to yet another FEE Online A to Z. Today we have a very special feature presentation for you because we have a very special guest. Our guest is Robert Anthony Peters, who is an entrepreneur, freedom activist, executive producer, filmmaker, actor, and at best he has many other accolades. So how are you doing, Robert?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Z.
And the reason why we have Robert with us today is because today is a kind of anniversary, a 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square events in China. And we're going to talk to Robert about this. Now, the reason we're going to talk to Robert about because Robert is an author of a movie called Tank Man. So Robert, what's that Tank Man movie about? Obviously, it's about the events. Why did you call it Tank Man?
Right. So as your audience is probably very familiar, if for no other reason than the picture associated with the invitation to this event, it's a photo of the man whom we commonly call Tank Man, this gentleman who stood in front of these tanks that were driving down the road in Beijing the morning after the Tiananmen Square Massacre. This one lone figure who stopped that path, and that image is one of the most inspiring of the 20th century by far. And it's been seen all over the world, and it's revered in pretty much everywhere but China.
Right, so it's one guy, I remember one guy, 3 tanks, and tanks try to get past them, and he basically keeps on blocking their way.
And it's actually more than 3 tanks. I don't know how many are in this line, but it's I think the photos at least have it. We see like about a dozen of them headed down the block, and there may be ones around the corner. I mean, it's just no shortage. It seems like a limitless state that is an all-powerful entity that this man is trying to thwart.
Now that happened a long time ago. I think I was 8. I think some of our viewers, they might have remembered it personally. Some of our viewers might be younger. So why don't you give us a sort of a short history refresher? What the protest was all about? Why did it happen? How did it lead to the fact that Chinese people were protesting the government to such an extent that they sent the tanks out there?
Yeah, well, I'm much more familiar with it because I was 10 years old at the time. So,
No, that explains it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, of course, we could do a long dissertation throughout Chinese history. I wouldn't be the best person to do that. But there's all of these little pieces that lead up to it. But we'll kind of narrow in on that year. And so in April of 1989, a gentleman, Hu Yaobang, who was a reformist in the government, he had passed away. And he was somebody that the student activists, the kind of concerned reformists were attracted to this man because he was always trying to engage these reforms, get rid of more corruption and kind of give more freedoms to the students and the workers and your average citizen, and not have those benefits concentrated as much with the parties, as we know tends to go in hand with any of these communist regimes. It's equality for all, right? But it's in reality, it's equality generally of poverty for most everybody, and then the elite, the political elite, tend to do well. And China was no different from any place else. So there was this great reformist, and he had passed away. And so this impromptu gathering of these protesters and activists and concerned students, they gathered at Tiananmen Square. And this was in April of 1989. And Tiananmen Square is kind of like, like if you lived in a town and you've got the courthouse square or the city hall, it's the place where everybody visited. It was like where, the National Mall where in DC, where you'll have major protests, the Million Man March, or Martin Luther King was giving a talk, things like that. It's a major central spot. And historically, it's been a spot where people would bring grievances. There was a student protest there in 1919. And but it's so associated with the Chinese people and the Chinese state. And so...
And what city is that? Is that Beijing?
Correct. That's in Beijing. And so, the powers that be were not thrilled about this, but they were hoping that it would kind of go away. And they would occasionally disperse the crowd, and then the crowd would come back.
How large are the crowd? A couple of students, couple of hundred students, a million students?
Hundreds to thousands eventually. So it continued to grow over time. And as it grew, they started to make demands. They wanted to present the government with a list of demands. These are what our concerns are. And they were more reasonable, and they were associated a lot with things like corruption and opportunity upon graduation, which they felt was very limited, which I have a feeling we're going to see more of that in the future as we go down the road, as we have so many people get college degrees and are promised all sorts of opportunities that await them when they graduate. And in reality, it's not quite there unless, you want to pay for a 4-year degree and bag at Trader Joe's. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a lot of money to pay to have those kinds of jobs. They were in similar circumstances. And so they were very frustrated. And the Chinese government was very resistant to capitulate in any way, to even discuss. And they wanted to discuss with kind of hand-selected leaders that they chose who didn't represent these demands. The students, felt that this was very disingenuous. Well, simultaneously, the U.S., we're all here in America, of course, we're familiar with the Cold War between the U.S. and Russia, the Soviet Union at the time. China had a similar Cold War between China and the Soviet Union. Just because they were communists didn't mean they all agreed. So,
yeah, if I may interrupt, I remember during history classes and things like that, but there was an episode in history where Soviets were approaching Americans and basically covertly asking, what would Americans do if Soviet Union launched nuclear weapons against China? So I think that in some of the circles, the thinking was that sooner or later that will need to happen anyway. So better do it now rather than later. So yes, I think many people sort of forget the so-called Sino-Soviet split, that they actually shot at each other and had territorial ambitions against each other. And if I may make a sort of a small digression, so after Crimea, when Russia annexed Crimea and claimed historic Russian lands, I think it was Angela Merkel or someone from a German government that was visiting China and gave them the map of something like 18th century Asia map, which parts of what is now Russia was obviously parts of what was then China. So yeah, I think many people forget that. So China was really without many friends anyway.
Yes, that's very true. And so, but Gorbachev was going to meet with Deng Xiaoping, who was in the president of China at the time, and was probably their greatest liberal leader. Now, it's a very low bar, but he was probably their greatest liberal leader since 1940, since the Chinese Communist Party took over. I mean, he engaged in a tremendous number of economic reforms. And of course, Gorbachev was reform-minded as well. So you had these two, the kind of most liberal communists, liberal in our sense, communists, that we've seen. Again, low bar, but hey, we'll take what we can get if we can alleviate some of this just tragic human suffering. And so they were going to meet and talk. And this was a huge deal. And they were very excited, both sides, to get wonderful press. So you've got the Western media flying in. They want to see photos of these two gentlemen together. But something else catches their eye. And that is the charm, the charisma, the passion of these student protesters. And the Western media ignores Deng and Gorbachev, and they focus on these students. And that was very disheartening to the government, and it was kind of adding a further insult to injury, kind of exacerbating their frustration and annoyance with the student protesters. Eventually, Beijing has had enough with it, and they send in troops to disperse the crowd, and eventually by force. And that's where we see what we call the massacre, which to this day, I think the Chinese government claims that 214 people died. External estimates are between 800 and 10,000 people I think it lies somewhere in the middle there would be my best guess. But it was certainly a lot of bloodshed. The majority of it, of course, lost by the protesters and the citizens.
Right. So the tanks was it the beginning of the bloodshed, or was it actually more towards the end of the bloodshed?
This was at the end. This was the next day. This was after the crowds had been cleared from the protest, and I think it was just it seems as if this was somebody who had enough, had seen enough or heard about enough or witnessed enough, and wasn't willing to tolerate any more destruction without doing something. And yeah, I mean, the accounts that you read, the photos that you can see of the aftermath of the massacre are just they're heart-wrenching. I mean, it's literally people crushed to death by tanks, people shot and killed. You see mangled bikes that were left there. I mean, you just you see what it was able to do to to an inanimate object, and then you just think of humans that were caught in that path, and it's just
that is definitely sad. Well, let me ask you sort of a history buff question. So you see tanks in Hungary, you see tanks in Czechoslovakia in '68. You see there was a reason why totalitarian governments used to send in tanks against the citizens who were unarmed. Do you know what that reason is?
No. I mean, other than to just show tremendous amount of force and discourage people from because the belief would be that their actions would be ineffective against that.
Well, I read a different account. I think it comes from 1956 Budapest uprising. So what the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact, what they saw is that if you just sort of have soldiers or troops or forming a cordon or not letting people through, they actually start talking to the people. And then they start talking to the people, they're much less likely to shoot them, meaning you get camaraderie between the protesters who obviously are unarmed. Soldiers obviously realize that they do not possess any real physical threat because they're unarmed. So it's really hard to ask your soldiers to shoot at them. I think the Soviets noticed that, and that's why they put in troops in tanks, which of course are very impractical if you think about the city. I mean, tank is a show of force, but in terms of a city, it's a very, very bad sort of logistical solution. So what actually...
There's two things I want to hit on about that, and one is that was exactly what was happening. Is the protesters were talking to the soldiers. They'd call them brother, do you really want to do this? They would give them rice, because most of these people were soldiers. They were out from the countryside where they had grown up. They had never been to the city. It was terrifying. They didn't know these people. They were just like a lot of soldiers. Hey, this is just my job. I'm sent here to do this. And they'd be saying that, and they'd say, do you want to hurt us? And the soldiers would say, no, but we're told to come here. And they'd be giving them food and rice and talking to them. And of course, that kind of thing is extremely dangerous, because God forbid peace break out in the midst of a possible war. The other aspect, of course, is when we watch the footage of Tank Man, we see him. Now, I didn't show all of that at the end, the historical footage. I only showed a part of it. But if you research, and anybody who is interested at all in this topic, which hopefully we've sparked some bit of interest in you, watch the full footage of Tank Man. He gets on top of the tank. He knocks on the top, and the soldier in there comes out. They exchange some words. We don't know what they said, but you look at that, and it's a tank, but there are people inside that tank. And that person, it wasn't a vehicle malfunction. He chose to stop his vehicle, because I think this is another aspect where it's easier to deal with a mob. It's easier to run over a mob or something like that than it would be to run over one individual. You have to recognize that isn't a mob. It's not an amorphous thing. That is one single person. And I think that's tougher to do than it is when you can spray gunfire indiscriminately. And so that person in the tank chose to stop. And I always find that to be incredibly encouraging as well, because as much as some of us may see these people as our enemies, we have to recognize they are humans and they have that capacity. Most all of them have that capacity inside to relate. And if we can tap into that, we can get them to stop driving their tanks and stop driving over people.
If I may jump into something what you mentioned of soldiers being from a countryside and never have been to the city. So I think that's exactly from a playbook of Soviet Union, because what they did, I mean, they wanted to dehumanize others. So if you served in the Soviet army made sure you did not serve in your own country. So let's say my father, obviously he's Lithuanian, he's from Lithuania, he served somewhere in the Caucasus where he didn't know anyone. And I remember, and then people in Estonia were from Chechnya. And so basically they intentionally put the soldiers in a very alien environments, so they would have no connections to the people there. So I think, I mean, then we talk about totalitarian regimes and, you know, the soldiers and the army. I think it's also a mistake to sort of lump them as the kind of the evil arm of the government. Sure, there were fanatics, there were people like in special forces and security apparatus, but many of the soldiers, the conscripts, they probably didn't really care about communism, nor did they really know what it was. But they were there, they had orders, the threats, and they just had to go with them. So I think it's kind of a tragedy of the protesters to be in front of the tank. It's probably also tragic for the people who are driving the tank.
Of course, and just like you said, I mean, and in those conditions, this is some place where they get a meal, they get clothed, they get housed, they get a meal. I mean, these are conditions under which people are starving to death in these countries. So when there's an opportunity, I mean, you don't have the luxury to say, well, how does this fit in with my moral appraisal of how I should behave in the world? I mean, that's a luxury that many of us can afford, and they can't. You know, they're thinking, you know, either they're completely conscripted and didn't even have a choice in the matter, or they're choosing like, this is, it's either starvation, you know, on a farm that doesn't even produce, or that all my production is extracted, or I can do this and, you know, feed myself and my family. So, you know, and it's not that we're trying to justify their choices or behaviors. Maybe that justifies it, maybe not. But at the very least, it helps give us a reason and say, it's not that they're monsters necessarily. You know, they could have very valid, very human reasons, desperate reasons for why they're doing what they're doing.
Right. Or like in case of Soviet Union, no one really asked whether you wanted to serve in the army or not. It was pretty much conscription.
Yeah. Okay, it was your gift.
I think we've talked enough about ourselves. Let's talk about the actual person. From what I've read, the choice of Tankman or the name of a Tankman for your movie is not just a moniker. That's how people refer to him. Is it still the case that people don't really know who he is?
That's correct. I mean, there have been some speculations, some investigative journalists, people who've come forward. I mean, every time I give a talk, usually about 1 in 10 people will come up and say, and I know somebody who knows that guy. And, but he's this apparition. And they've tried to identify who he is, but I don't think any of it's accurate. We do only see the back of his head in the footage, in any of the photos. Really, we don't have any sort of clear head-on view. Nobody's really come forward and said, this is the guy. So I think it's still up in the air what his identity is. And he's called, kind of depends on, he's also called the Unknown Rebel. So there's different monikers for it. I think the most common one is Tankman. He's, one of my favorite stories about the aftermath of that is, I was listening to an interview, and a gentleman was recounting. He said they were at the Berlin Wall, and some guy was heading up with a sledgehammer, and this reporter said, why is it that you're doing this? What makes you feel that you are able to do this? And he said, hey, listen, if that Chinese fella could do what he did, then we can do this. And it was just, wow. I mean, that image has been such a powerful, inspirational one to so many in the world. And as I mentioned at the beginning, to everywhere in the world, except for China, who refuses to, they showed that video once, is my understanding, in China. And the Chinese government, who controls the media, they said, this is an example of an insane person and how restrained the Chinese military is, that they would not kill this person because he was clearly had a mental illness, and we wouldn't do that kind of a thing. But that was, I think, even that they knew people weren't buying that. And so that was the only time that I've heard of that has been shown officially in China. And otherwise it's under wraps. And the whole incident of the Tiananmen Square Massacre is either ignored or misrepresented, at least from what our understanding of what the events are.
We had a question from one of the viewers, and please, I think we have more than 100 people registered for this talk, so don't feel it's just me and Robert chatting, because we can go on for hours and hours, but please submit your questions through Q&A. So the question number one to you, do you think that the story of Tank Man and the example of humanity is stronger because he remains anonymous and symbolic for all of us?
I think there's a lot of power to that. I mean, I think it can go both ways. I mean, we like to see people and know their identity and look up to them. It's great to have a real heroes in our midst. And, a lot of times in the US, we will think of things like, great entrepreneurs like a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates or something like that. People who've revolutionized, Elon Musk, and these can be heroes for you for various reasons. And that's exciting. But certainly characters like Robin Hood, people in stories and fables and tales and things that are more anonymous, more ethereal, that's exciting too. And part of that, and I think what Tank Man, the anonymity of Tank Man really taps into is, and this was to me kind of the danger of putting a face to him, was making it more concrete, because somewhat when the more ethereal, the more anonymous he is, the more we can put ourselves in his place. There are less things that allow us to say, well, I'm not like him. There's more that we can say, like, well, maybe I could do something like that. If pushed, I at least gives us thought. If pushed, I wonder, could I do something like that? And that's why I wanted to paint him as a seemingly everyday kind of a person, because I think he was, but B, also so that those of us who are everyday people like me, I don't, Z, you're obviously much special above us, but
you mean taller?
Yeah, but it's important that we have that. In fact, when I was first designing some of my talks to give around the film, I had been kind of anticipating doing this for because I love talking about liberty. So, it's when I can fuse my art to that, it's like bonus time for me. And I wanted to talk about heroes, and that was my main goal. And then of course, everything in Hong Kong popped up. And so it became much more relevant to address what is happening specifically with China and Hong Kong. But I was thinking of our hero here much like Frodo Baggins in Lord of the Rings, for those who are familiar, where you have this, Frodo's this little hobbit guy. He's not a strong warrior. He's not a wizard with magic spells. And I mean, you look at this guy, there's very little he can do. He could probably make you a nice lunch, but that's about the extent of his superpowers. And so, but he becomes this hero, right? He takes on this task that's seemingly above him, above his station in life. But because he has courage and fortitude, he is able to go forth and, defeats the evil thing. And that's the way I view this gentleman, is that, he does not look like a hero, right? He's not buffed. He doesn't have a bazooka.
I think what's happening is this sort of psychological thing, is precisely because we know nothing of him. On one hand, he's pure. I mean, we do not know of any if he was a good person. Maybe he hated animals. We don't know any of that. We have this pure moment of his action, and that kind of elevates him to the near mythical status, and maybe it is deserved. I think a second thing, what you did with your Frodo Baggins reference, I think it allows us to project our own image or how we imagine things. So you mentioned Lord of the Rings and Frodo Baggins. I thought about Half-Life and Gordon Freeman. The character, the sort of your avatar who doesn't say anything throughout the entire game, and that's why people, once again, I think it's a not so much a psychological trick as it is a feature or just a human nature to kind of ascribe these things to them. Now, do you think that we don't know him purely because he was so anonymous, or do you think there was some sort of cover-up?
Well, again, it's a good question because we don't know his fate. At the end of the historical footage, you've got these kind of people who shepherd him off of the street. And there's more than two ways of looking at it, but I think there's two main ways. One is those were the secret police, and they brought him off and they executed him, sent him to a gulag, something like that. The second view, and I think it's more accurate, because if it was the secret police, they probably would not have been so gentle with this guy. They probably would have punched him, knocked him down, dragged him off. I think it was people who are just like, man, you did your thing. You said your piece. You made the stand. Get the hell out of here. And what I'm hoping, as the optimist that I am, is that he went off back into the anonymity, and to the point where he doesn't even know that he's a hero to millions around the world.
So would that imply, and that there's a question from one of our viewers, is that picture, I think you mentioned, so that picture, is it circulating in China today? Is it some sort of symbol, or it's completely blacked out?
That is blacked out, as blacked out as they can. In fact, so last year, right around this time, June 4th, a few days before, WeChat, which is the Chinese kind of equivalent to Facebook, their social media function, was shut down for repairs for a period of several days. This is to me, this is not a coincidence. It is not a coincidence that the national security law that was just enacted in Hong Kong happened right before the June 4th anniversary, because every year in Hong Kong, June 4th, they hold a vigil. And this year they've been banned. It's happening even without them, even without the official permission. They're doing it anyways. But it is no coincidence that these things happen right around June 4th, the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. Even so, protesters, activists have taken to trying to find different ways to get this out there, because you can't do it directly, right? I mean, it's much like, Václav Havel, right, would write plays, and it'd be these allegories, because you can't confront the issue head on. And he'd still get in trouble, but that's what you have to do when you're in these oppressive societies. And so 8964 is one of the symbols that they use to represent Tiananmen Square and what's happening, what happened that time. 1989, June 4th, 8964. And so there was a spirit company, a liquor company that made a liquor 8964. That, of course, got banned. The use of 8964 in any sort of communications in China is banned. I mean, you're not even saying directly anything, and you can't get away with that. So no, they certainly won't allow the image to circulate in mainland China. And this is one of the problems they're having, is because you can do that. They have the June 4th museum, even though in Hong Kong, but even though it gets constantly harassed and shut down, and they have to reopen it in different spots.
Well, let's talk about your movie, because I mean, you made the movie, you filmed what you imagined what this guy looks like. I've seen the movie, excellent movie, check it out. It's Tank Man. There are links in the description that you can download it and watch it. So I remember in your movie, and I remember in the picture, the guy's carrying 2 bags. Do we know what's in these bags? Why is he carrying 2 bags? Was he carrying something important there? Was he the guy who just had his groceries done?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. We have no idea. So I started with what we do know, and I worked my way backwards. And that was one of the things. People, I still remember last year listening to a podcast, and this guy on American podcast was like, well, of course this is all BS by, the Western media invented Tiananmen Square Massacre. It didn't happen. I mean, you have this image of this guy, he's got grocery bags. He was just out shopping. If there was a riot, how could he go out shopping? I mean, it doesn't make sense. And if I didn't know much about the event, I'd say, well, yeah, I think the guy's got a point. That doesn't make sense. Who goes out grocery shopping during a riot? That's crazy. But there's more than one ways to have grocery bags full of whatever or any of these things. And so that's all I did was wanted to do is create a backstory that helps justify the things that we see. Is it accurate? I have no idea. I made it up, Is it plausible? Yeah, it's plausible. It's definitely possible.
Where did you shoot it? Did you shoot it in China, in Hong Kong, or somewhere in the US? Or is that the creator's secret?
Yeah. It's I would have loved to have shot it in Beijing. That would have been awesome. You cannot shoot anything around Tiananmen Square other than photos. If they see anything that you're doing, any sort of coverage that they think might be have any sort of dissent associated with it, they shut you down immediately. There's one story I'd like to tell about a great film that was made at the same time as mine was being made. It's called Empty Skies, and it's about the Great Leap Forward, which I don't know if your audience, how familiar they may be with it, but it's one of the great ironic names, as the 30 million people died over the course of 3 years in China, mainly of starvation. And this is considered a great leap forward. But I guess when you have fewer mouths to feed, you can do more with fewer resources. So, but she went to create this film in China, and she's a Chinese national who had been studying in the U.S. They go back there. The day they're set to start filming, her father gets a call, and says, they say, yeah, your daughter doesn't want to shoot this film. In fact, your daughter wants to go back to the U.S. So dad calls, explains to his daughter what her daughter wants to do, as he was told. And fortunately, they were able to, through some great freedom activist programs here, produce that film around the same time. And it's a beautiful film. It's a great film, but you can't shoot any of these kinds of things in China. It's just not. It's not possible. And initially I wanted to shoot in San Francisco because that's where I'm from originally, and their Chinatown is beautiful. But then I talked to people from China, and they said, yeah, it looks more like Hong Kong. It doesn't look like Beijing. I was like, well, tell me more about Beijing. What does that more look like? They're like, well, it just looks like another ugly city. So I was, oh, great, ugly city. We'll go to Los Angeles then. It'll work perfectly, and we have all the resources there.
Yeah, you mentioned the Great Leap Forward. So once again, I think like two stories from a Great Leap Forward stand out. So one of them was the battle to produce steel, which means which is such a Soviet or central government way to do things. Basically, every village got assigned a quota to produce X tons of steel, which of course is silly when you think about it. You have an agricultural village. How are we going to produce steel? So what happened is, well, first of all, there was a large deforestation because you need to cut down trees so you can, so you can have a fire or a kiln in which to make steel. But then again, where are you going to get the raw materials for that? So what ended up happening, people ended up melting their agricultural implements to make steel, which of course is both ironic and sad. I don't know which is predominant here. Which of course was one of the reasons why there was starvation, because people basically, they ended up melting their shovels and pots and pans just to make steel. So that's one. And second one, which is kind of a little bit less sad, but there was a large Chinese campaign, I think something like Big Four, and one of those was a battle against Big Four, and one of the four was sparrows. Because someone very smart in the central government figured out that sparrows eat a lot of grain and calculated that, we have a couple of billion sparrows, which means so and so many billions of grain lost. So let's eradicate the sparrows and, have a lot of bread. And boy, did that turn out wrong. I mean, people, what happened throughout the entire China, I bet you know the stories, they eradicated sparrows. And one of the ways they poisoned them, they shot them, or barely frightened them to such an extent that sparrows couldn't land to rest, and if sparrows cannot land to rest, they basically go into cardiac arrest and die. Yeah. So whenever a flock of sparrows would go down to rest, people would bang pots and pans and fireworks. So you have these billions of dead sparrows, and then of course you had pests like insects and bugs completely devastating.
Sparrows don't just eat the grain; they eat the locusts, who also eat the grain. Nobody eat the locusts? Great, the locusts will just eat the grain, and they can repopulate much easier than sparrows. That's exactly what Empty Skies is about. Empty skies because there's no sparrows in them. Yeah, it's a great film, and it's such a tragedy. And they still, the Chinese government still refers to that as the period of natural disasters, because they view that the locust coming in and eating the grain is a natural disaster. And to the extent that humans are a part of nature, and I believe we are, then sure, it is a natural disaster, but it's a natural disaster by human design.
Right. Well, when did ever the central planners admit they were wrong, you know?
Yeah, and the fact that this political party, this government that is responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people is still in existence today. I mean, this is just unconscionable, right? I mean, it'd be like having the Nazi Party still a viable political party in Germany, or the Communist Party still, pursuing to be in charge of Russia. I mean, some of these people have just switched hats and they're still just awful people. But at least people don't tolerate having that continuity. Whereas that's exactly what we have in China. The party that has been making people suffer for 80 years, 70 years is still in existence.
We have a question which I think ties, we kind of went into politics all of a sudden, but I guess that's what you get to two freedom-loving people talking about China, you're gonna end up in politics pretty soon. So I remember from history that partially Cultural Revolution was partially inspired by the fact that many young people could not get into universities and had pretty much nothing to do, and Mao seized the opportunity. In your description of the Tiananmen Square incidents, you also mentioned something that, you know, there were like limited opportunities for young people, and that of course was probably a factor in brewing discontent. So one of our listeners asked, you know, could a potentially a similar kind of protest movement or a student movement arise in China in 2020 or at an early future?
It's possible. I am not currently as optimistic about it, and partially because even though one of the big improvements, and that was started by Deng Xiaoping, is the economic well-being of the people. And that goes a long way. There's a lot of people who are doing very well because of the capitalist elements that they've allowed into China. And really, I don't think, even though it's still called the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping is trying to bring in more communist elements in some fashion, it's not an exemplar of communism. It's an exemplar of totalitarianism, of statism, of corporatism, of, you know, really, really awful crony capitalism with a lot of socialism still thrown in. But there's a lot of people who are more comfortable right now because of the economic changes that have occurred. And they're willing to live without the personal freedoms. And I think that there are enough people who are comfortable and just don't have that desire. And part of that is the culture over the last 100 years that has changed some of that. And so I think I'd like to think at some point, I mean, we've talked about this from our side, right? Where, well, first you get economic well-being and economic freedoms, and then it moves into the personal freedoms, and people fight for that and demand that. I think China is a counterexample, and it's an extremely strong counterexample. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that changes over time, but I'm just not seeing it. We're seeing a lot of students, Chinese students around the globe, who are silencing the pro-Hong Kong protesters on their campus because they love this state and they love what the state is affording them. And they've got a good life and they don't want to jeopardize that. And there is a lot of national pride that's being instilled. And, you know, and we view this, right? The concepts of patriotism. And I think, sometimes that can be sometimes it can be a good notion, but that's a very dangerous tool because a lot of bad things can be justified under that mantle.
And it's tricky, and I think it's very well you mentioned of Xi Jinping, of Qin trying to bring back some sort of elements of communism, because even if a protest movement did arise, it doesn't necessarily mean it would be a pro-liberty, pro-capitalism, pro-freedom movement. Sometimes you get these reactionary movements. I recall from my personal experience, so there I was in Vilnius, we're training some Belarusian opposition on how to do campaigning and things like that, and so we sit down, they all don't like the current dictator or the current president, pick whichever term you like better. So I was talking to them, I said, you don't like Lukashenko, what is it that you don't like about him? And to my absolute amazement, they started talking about how he betrayed the principles of Marxism. So, this is not communism, this is not Marxism, this is capitalism, and this is basically what we don't like about it. Which, of course, had my worldview smashed in a couple of minutes, and I thought, do I really want to help these folks? But the point is, I think in the West, we often assume that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but I think the Middle Eastern proverb that says the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy can be very, very, very useful here. Okay, since we started talking about protests, there is some topics we cannot avoid, and we have protests right now in the United States. Now, here we go. Let's grab the bull or the dragon by the horns. How would you compare the protests that are happening right now in the U.S. and the protests which your movie is about? Are they similar? Are they different? Are they more similar? Are they more different?
There are definitely some relationships between the two. There are definitely some similarities between the two, and one of which is one of the 5 demands that the Hong Kong protesters had made a while ago. Throughout this past year of protests, has been police accountability, and that there has been police violence, and it's not being effectively investigated and independently, judiciously investigated. And certainly, obviously, there's a correlation between that and the protests that are going on in the U.S. and not without merit. And there are protests in the U.S. that have been peaceful. There are protests in the U.S. that have directly targeted what it is they have a problem with, whether it's City Hall or the police department and those governmental agencies that are responsible for any this, if I'm being gentle, malfeasance. If I'm not being gentle, we could say extrajudicial execution or murder, as that one officer is being charged with 3rd-degree murder. But we also see looting going on, destruction of private property. And it seems that in at least a lot of the cases that we're seeing, it's people that are wholly unrelated to these incidences. And it's justified by some sort of notion of some sort of systemic issue, which makes, I guess, everybody responsible. I think that's a tough case to make. I mean, for those of us who value individualism and who see justice as having some sort of proportionality and directness between people that are involved in an incident, we can't justify that. I find it unreasonable to destroy, your local. I saw an optometrist store in New York that was destroyed and looted. I can't fathom what that person has to do with it. Maybe they do. Maybe that was targeted, and I'm just misinformed. But there seems like there's enough incidences, and nobody is making any sort of declaration of, hey, we took on this because he contributes to such and such political office, and this is the cause of the problem. What we did see in Hong Kong was quite different, and in fact, I participated in protests in July of last year. A tremendous number of people out there. Everything I witnessed was completely peaceful. It had taken turns later on down the road where there had been incidences of violence. There's a lot of support that I've seen and evidence that I've seen from people that, particularly initially, some were police officers in plain clothes that would infiltrate and then throw bricks and things like that. But most of the violence, when you read about it, when you read these statements that came out about destruction of property, for instance, with the Legco building, that's their governmental building, their bicameral house there. They when they invaded that, the destruction was very specific. They destroyed the portraits of their political opponents. They left the others. Works of art and antiquity were left. In fact, there were notes that were set by them saying, be sure this doesn't get broken or damaged or stolen. This is a valuable historical piece. Those were fine. And so their violence, their destruction was very specifically targeted. And even when they were taking it into businesses, there were businesses who had ties with mainland China and the CCP. And so these were, maybe that's not just, I'm not a moral philosopher. I don't have, a huge, I don't have any sort of strict claim on what the answer is. But what I can say is it seemed that those were well thought out, and it was justified in a way that was maybe even more convenient for me to say, okay, I can see that, and I might even be okay with that kind of destruction because it was targeted, it was specific, and it was related to their grievances.
Right. There's another question, I think, since you are in the media, many people are willing to ask, myself included. So is it your impression that somehow the current Chinese government is portrayed unnecessarily positively in the media? And let me give you my very personal example. So I was watching, a couple of years ago, I was watching Transformers 4: The Age of Extinction, which is it's a Michael Bay explosion fest, but some of that action is happening in China. And it's basically some bad things happening, and they have the dialogue between two sort of Chinese extras. One of them says, bad things happening, let's go alert the central government. They will take care of this. Something along these lines. Now, obviously, that's a factoid, a tidbit that is stuck in my head. But then you have these other movies coming out with legit Hollywood celebrities like The Great Wall and things like that. Now, is it just the Chinese version of Rocky IV, which is a great movie, by the way, or do you see some sort of nefarious soft power exertion, creating of narratives that somehow coming out from China?
To answer the first iteration of your question, all governments are unnecessarily and inaccurately portrayed positively, I think. But specifically with China, I think that without a doubt, there is a tremendous amount of soft power exertion. I mean, one of the big things big stories from last year was the remake of the Tom Cruise Top Gun, where, you've got his jacket, but this time there's no Taiwanese flag on it. Why? Because Taiwan is a part of China, according to the People's Republic of China. Whereas, the Republic of China, Taiwan, they view the PRC, the mainland, as part of their China. But you couldn't have that. Why? Because the Chinese Communist Party won't allow it. Because they are not going to fund it. They would stop funding it, which they were, one of the entities funding the film. But also, everybody needs Chinese distribution to make their money. And so if the Chinese government is not going to allow you to screen your film there, you're missing out on the biggest global market, the one that most people are making those action films now, those high budget films. They all are made so that it can go through Chinese censorship. And this is a huge issue now with Hollywood, because you think, not only can you not really make a film that will piss off China because it's not going to be screened there, but you probably can't even say anything that will make China mad because they may not let you they may not let you, take a film that you're in. There was another film, gosh, I'm forgetting it, last year, but caused a big controversy in Asia because they made this map, and on it, it showed China, and it had all these territories and bodies of water that are in dispute, and they gave it all to China. And so it was an animated feature. I think it was The Abominable. I think that was the name of it. And it was, the Philippines wouldn't screen it there because they basically, it showed this map where China owned these waters that where the Philippines are like, hey, those are ours. And there was another country that also took issue with it. And I think it was South Korea, or it could have been Japan. But everybody's trying to make China happy right now. And it's really hard. And in fact, just to, microcosm back to our film Tank Man, when I was auditioning people, and I insist on having an all Chinese cast, I wanted to be as authentic as possible and give the detractors as little to complain about as they could. I had many actors who said, once they realized what the project was about, they said, I got to bow out. I can't be a part of this project because I'm either a Chinese national and it's too dangerous, I have to go back, or I have family there, or I hope to go there someday. And these things all would jeopardize either my or people I care about, their health and well-being. And so when you have to make those kinds of decisions on just a short film, it's really scary. The other thing on the distribution side, I was attempting to do a June 4th screening I live in Tucson, in my town of Tucson. And we have a Chinese cultural center. We've got a decent size historic Chinese community here. And so I was talking with them about renting space. I thought this would be a cool venue to do it in, and went back and forth talking about availability and price and things. Great. And they said, well, what do you want to do? So I described to them, I'm an honest fellow. I described to them what I was planning to do. Radio silence. Have yet to hear back from them. They would not have anything to do with it. We've been received in 2 Asian-related film festivals, one in Hong Kong and one in Houston. I've submitted to every Chinese film festival in China. Of course, I got rejected from those, but tons of Asian American film festivals. And how many, I know I'm a white guy making this film, and I could see, okay, not everybody is going to go for it because of that. Fine. But how many films have all Chinese cast? Not a ton. And, the film's got its flaws, but it's not garbage. It's not a terrible film. It's a good serviceable piece. And so, it's a good piece. It's got an all Chinese cast. Why is it that every Asian American film festival, except for one in the US, has refused to allow us to screen? And some of them, I'm sure, is artistic reasons or doesn't fit in with their theme or what have you. But to have all of them do that, I think there's at least some of those decisions are made on, we don't want to poke that bear.
Well, and that's happening in America and the United States. You're getting rejected from film festivals in the US?
Yes. Well, even like I couldn't get, Chinese US actors to engage, or, and we see this. It was, tons of films that are modified to keep China happy. It's all over the industry.
Wow. I mean, censorship is awful, but I think self-censorship, that's even worse. That's self-censorship, that's censor's dream, basically. You don't have to do anything and people bend backwards to please the censor.
Yeah. It is, you're in a comfortable position when you don't even need to do the work because the people will do the work for you. They'll stop the freedom activism. The Chinese students will stop their other fellow Chinese or Hong Kong students from protesting. They'll do it for you. You don't have to send in troops. You don't even have to pass bills or laws, because you've got the culture so locked down. And that's one of the things that I found terrifying, because obviously I made this historical piece. I love history. I first wanted to be a history teacher. That was when I first went to college.
I was a history teacher for a bit.
Nice. That's like a dream come true for me. So, everywhere I go to the history museum. go to the Museum of Hong Kong History, and what do they have there? Here's my guide. A special exhibit is The Road to Modernization, 70 Years of the People's Republic of China. This is the special exhibit they have going on, sponsored, of course, by Beijing. And I toured it, and it was fascinating. It was as if nothing bad ever happened in China since communism took over. There was no mention of mass starvation during the period of the Great Leap Forward. There's no mention of Tiananmen Square Massacre. There was no mention of anything bad. Basically, the whole notion behind it was things were terrible. The Chinese government came in, the Chinese Communist Party came in, took over, and now things just keep getting better and better, and we look towards a bright future. And this is their version of history. And it's not that history has to be all about wars and tragedies and all these bad things happening all the time. You know, nobody wants that to be their entire history. We want to celebrate the good things. And I love the fact that less people are starving to death in China now. Like that's wonderful. But you cannot have any sort of representation of history without showing even problems and saying, hey, we made a mistake. But of course you can't do that there. You can't say, it's very rare that they've acknowledged that mistakes have happened. They have done that, to be fair, but it's very infrequent and it's very delicately done. And of course, the Soviet Union was similar too. You know, occasionally they'd say, there's a problem, but you know, we're on it now, we're solving it. But even this exhibit didn't even have that.
So final sort of question from one history teacher to another. What can we learn from all this? You know, one sort of sad quip about history is that it's most useless science because people never learn anything. Do we learn anything from this? Why is the story of a tank man still important so many years later?
I think the most important takeaway from this is the power of an individual to affect change. And he may not have even affected much, if any, change in China, but he affected change across the world. You know, people were and still are inspired by this one man's action, this seemingly humble, everyday fellow, and what he did. One small moment in time. And I think that gives us so much reason for optimism, so much reason for inspiration, that even these small things that we do, can have these great effects. Little divergence. Rose Wilder Lane, who some of the audience may be familiar with her. She wrote Discovery of Freedom, which I think FEE printed for a while. And she would write to, when she would moderate or judge debates in high school, and she would kind of correspond with the students that she felt were bright and things. And eventually this one student who was opposed to her ideas initially, he became, I don't know, like some sort of libertarian activist, like 10 years later. And she was just so excited because she had no idea, but all those little things. And Leonard Reed was like that, the founder of FEE, right? He would go around and he didn't care how small the group was. He would go because he never knew. The remnant is out there. You know, Albert J. Nock talks about the remnant and Isaiah's job. And it's our job to go and put this message out there, make this available so those people who need to find it can find it. We don't know who they are. We don't know when they'll find it or how they'll find it. So we have all these different ways, and we keep the ideas alive. We keep liberty fresh and available. And so when the right people are able and willing and ready to find it, they do. And I feel like this image here is just showing us that we don't know who that is or when they will act or what they will do. But it's essential that we do continue doing the things that we are doing to promote the ideas and keeping them fresh and available, so that when the next person who is our future tank man, comes and they encounter these ideas and they do this great act for liberty, we may never know. We may never know it ties back to us, but but it has. And so it's essential that we keep doing, so we stay on task, stay on our mission.
That was quite a soliloquy. If I might add my 2 cents, I would say yes, preserving of embers of liberty is great, but we at FEE are all about starting wildfires, because that's what we do. Thank you, Robert. Robert Anthony Peters and Tankman. If you want to watch the movie, click on the link included and you will see that. Robert, if people are interested in what you do, how can they, can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, it's very, very easy. And tankmanthemovie.com is our website. It hosts both the film. It also has links. We're on Tankman the Movie on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. Friend us, follow us, whatever it is. You can contact me through that site. My email is robert@robertanthonypeters.com. You can always get a hold of me. I love talking about this. We're not doing as many in-person events right now, but certainly online. I'd be more than happy to Zoom something with your group. And the film is out there and it's shareable. We have it in also in traditional Chinese subtitles. We also are preparing one in simplified Chinese, which is what most people in mainland do. So if you have any help, you can help us at all in infiltrating mainland China with that. We would love it. We're here to change the world.
All right, so contact Robert, watch Tankman, and if you contact Robert, he'll tell you the story. Is that a Chinese Statue of Liberty in his background? Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being with FEE. I shall see you on other A to Z town halls. I think the next one is on Monday, where we're going to be talking about market urbanism and what exactly does that mean. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, and see you guys.